Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for this dedicated health webinar delivered by Jim Bergman, lead of the Commercial Officers Group. As members of the Australian and New Zealand Health Procurement Roundtable and via the APCC, each of you can access the Commercial Officers Group resources, including targeted opportunities like today's webinar, which was brought about by discussions at various category working groups, which demonstrated a desire for further knowledge in this space. So Jim is a commercial contract professional with global experience spanning the USA, Latin America, UK, Europe, China, South Korea, Japan, India, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Australia. He's worked on a wide range of direct and indirect spend categories in numerous sectors, developing a deep knowledge of services, goods and technology, procurement and sales. Some of his areas of expertise include strategic sourcing, category management, contract management, and without further ado, I'd like to welcome Jim and thank him for providing the opportunity to listen to his expertise for this webinar on supply chain resilience through collaborative supplier relationship management. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Rowena, and thank you everyone for joining in today. We hope to make this interactive. It's always a challenge, but if you want to ensure it is interactive, we encourage you to put questions in the menu typically it's on the right-hand side of your screen from the GoToWebinar folks. They have a box in that menu that says questions. You just open that, type, and as we go through the next hour or so, I'll keep an eye on that panel and address those as we go. Don't hesitate if you have questions to raise them as we go. You don't have to save them to the very end. I really have found it to be more timely and effective when people get their answers immediately rather than having to wait until later in the session. So with that all said, why don't we get started? The topic around collaborative supplier relationship management has gotten a lot of momentum over the past 6 to 12 months in light of what's going on with the pandemic. More and more organizations are looking at how they can ensure that they are part of a resilient supply chain. They want to, as in the context and analogy of a supply chain, they want to ensure that they are not the weakest link. And so they want to find out how, when that interstitial fluid between them and the other links in their supply chain, they can fortify and strengthen that connectivity. And what we have found, not only over the past few months with the pandemic, but also 2008 with the global economic crisis, 2001 with terrorism and shutting down or hiccuping the economy, a variety of other instances between then and now, we've seen resilient supply chains as being an approach and a methodology that many have been gravitating towards. And so we see this as being a huge opportunity to raise the discussion yet again, and we wanted to today raise it within the context of the healthcare sector. The challenge that we see is that there are certain elements that are going to be needed for a resilient supply chain. And what are those SRM or supplier relationship elements? What can the professional within the Australian healthcare sector do in order to be an enabler of change, of ensuring that the resilience exists within the supply chain? Unfortunately, at times, some of us have been deemed more of a disabler than an enabler. And so we really wanted to equip you as a part of today's session to give you some thoughts, ideas around how to make some improvements, how to provide some value for money, how to help mitigate and manage risk with the context that many of us are sitting within this global pandemic. So the challenge is in front of us, and the solution, it's not easy. It's not as straightforward as something that can be totally covered in 1 hour, but we're going to at least try to scratch the surface. And so there's 6 elements we're going to look at during this hour. The first being how we can ensure that the optimal supplier relationship management models and the culture are in place within not only your organization, but also your supply chain partners. We want to look at how organizations can foster and catalyze innovation. Innovation is one of the cornerstones around resilience within supply chains, and without innovation, it's somewhat as trying to drive a car without gasoline in it, or electricity if you are with a Tesla. It is not going to get very far, and so it becomes quite challenging. We wanted to cover in today's session also how to build some of the SRM models and those relationships, build them more effective in this environment of VUCA. For those of you who are not familiar with VUCA, it's an acronym that stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And many treat VUCA as a threat. And we want to have people look at it slightly different, treat it more as an opportunity rather than a threat. When we do SWOT analysis, do we treat it as a O or a T of SWOT of opportunity and threats? And so we'll get into that and address how some organizations do their SWOT analysis and put it in the context of today's topic. We're going to look at how some within the healthcare sector have been equipping themselves with the necessary skills, as well as the optimal toolbox. We're never going to get a complete toolbox, unfortunately. There's always going to be something more. But if we look at some of the more common tools, such as segmentation models and contracts, to things that are a little bit more new and unique and leading edge, such as mutual risk registers, and I don't mean unilateral risk registers, but mutual risk registers, shared databases, the variety of technology offerings that are out there. So we're going to look at what goes into a toolbox. And then the final point is going to be relatively brief as we wrap things up, and how do parties craft a strategy, which is going to benefit their own organization, but also, and perhaps more importantly, others within the supply chain. And the reason I say perhaps more important is we cannot operate as an island. We cannot operate in a silo. We can, but it's going to be very short-lived. And so we have to find ways to extend what we view ourselves as pursuing to team members beyond just our fellow employees and ourselves. That the commercial relationships that we have, the commercial partners that we have, allow us to be able to generate value and to mitigate risk. And we have to look at it across our entire supply chain as one enterprise, an amalgam of varied organizations out there chasing a common pursuit. So with those points in mind, let's move forward. And one of the first things we want to do is, first off, get a common understanding definition around what is resilience. I'm seeing a comment where somebody is asking if the audio is on. I'm taking, Rowena, you're hearing what I'm saying, right? I just want to make sure that my audio is coming across.
Yeah, I'm hearing you quite clearly, Jim.
Okay, very good. For the individual who asked that question, unfortunately, I have to ask, maybe you need to check on your equipment because I don't think it's on this end. So with that said, resilience, what is it? You look in the common dictionaries out there, and many of them will reference that it is the ability or act of recovering quickly from difficulties or to efficiently overcome some obstacles. These are the more common definitions. But I'd like to throw in an element too around resilience, and that is that we have to continue to honor somewhat of our ethical constitution, our values, our core mission and vision and purpose, that without understanding and acknowledging and perpetuating those ethics and values, for us to overcome those obstacles and to recover from the difficulties tends to transform who we are and what we represent to our supply chain partners. And so we need to be, yes, resilient, but we have to do it within a certain consistency, a governance around some of the ethics and the values. And so with that said, around resilience, how can we ensure that we have resilience? What is the mode that many of us are taking through our supplier relationship management practices? Are we approaching those on a reactive basis or on a proactive basis? And unfortunately, this survey, this research we did within Commercial Officers Group is back in March of this year, looking at non-attorney stakeholders from both the buy side and the sell side, so both sellers and customers within the supply chain. The vast majority, around 75%, it's closer to 72, but close to 75%, said that their practices are reactive rather than proactive. And I would encourage you, if you're wanting to build strategy, to ask, how can we have strategy where we're merely being reactive? And that's very difficult. There has to be a certain amount of proactivity in how we approach SRM and to ensure that there's resilience. And in this era with the pandemic and the heightened need for resilience, the level of proactivity is going to go up. So we need to really, ask ourselves and challenge ourselves around how being proactive is going to be a core element around our strategy moving forward. Certain manifestations of being proactive are things such as a multi-party strategy, having sustained transformation through effective change management techniques, to be able to build communication strategies and tactics and make them effective throughout all of what we do within SRM, not only within our own organization and the skills of our own employees, but also of the employees of others in other organizations within that supply chain. And so anticipating a problem is one thing, but doing something about it before the problem fully materializes is another thing. And so having that strategy that cuts across multiple parties, not just one, such as ourselves, to be able to engage change management, communication strategy practices becomes absolutely essential. And so we need to have something that drives it. And yes, incentives are important. The incentives can range from anywhere from having a competitive advantage as a supply chain to creating greater value for money for all of the parties or links within the supply chain, the ability to mitigate risk rather than allocate risk. To mitigate risk is a great incentive. Our just continued existence should be incentive enough. But in many instances, people don't sense that there's an incentive. They know that it's something they should be doing, but there's not a compelling incentive that comes into play. And as such, the motives end up becoming suboptimal. And so we would want to encourage you as we get into this discussion to ask yourself, as you think about your SRM practices within the healthcare supply chain, are you being very proactive? Are you finding incentive that's motivating the organization as well as the individuals within the organization? Or is it just something that you know should be done and yet not much is being done about it? SRM takes more than just a few basic elements such as contracts and the relationships themselves. We encourage you, and we're seeing great research coming forward in our own experiences, that social norms and ethics are coming more and more into play. And the integration of social norms and relationships and contractual documents is creating a new body of knowledge out there known as relational contracting and collaborative contracting. I have personally spent a number of trips into Australia to be able to help a number of organizations put together collaborative relational contracting models, and it's been extremely successful. Not from me, but from the individuals within Australia who are actively engaged in pursuing this model. We're finding that when they integrate these three elements of the contract, the relationship, and social norms into one common theme, one common model or approach, it ends up creating a much stronger supply chain than what one would be able to have if they just focused on the relationship or the documents or the social norms. And when we mention social norms, because I'll mention it a few times through this session, what we're talking about is basically what we would be doing within society overall as a citizen of society. Things such as, reciprocity, fairness, kindness, things that, we sort of learned when we were 6 years old, of how to play nice in the sandbox. And those social norms of fairness and reciprocity and honesty, things of that nature, have increasingly found center stage in supplier relationship management methodologies, to the point where it becomes somewhat of a competitive differentiator for organizations who integrate those in rather than those who just rely on the relationships and or the contract documents. So integrating these three elements into one stronger rope, if you will, rather than three less strong ropes, is the model and the approach that we're seeing of helping ensure that the parties within a supply chain are creating a certain level of resilience and collaboration to be able to capture greater value for money, as well as to be able to mitigate and manage the risk. What our research also has shown from earlier this year is that the respondents to this question really gave relationships the highest level, but this yellow slice on the screen of integrating the three, when you combine those two, the yellow and the red slices together, are predominant of the answer. So which is the essential element in resilient supply chains? Contracts and social norms are important, yes, but many are saying relationships, but integration of the three is significant. If you're not integrating those three, then I encourage you, as we get here into the next 10 minutes, to give extra attention, because we want to share how others have been doing this. So the overall SRM strategy needs to ensure that there's resilience, but you can't really get that resilience in place if you don't have that supplier relationship management strategy. Is that strategy allowing you to be proactive or reactive? Are you able to respond immediately? Do your commercial partners within your supply chain know your strategy, and do you know their strategy? Having your own strategy and being part of a supply chain that's going to be resilient undercuts the overall effectiveness and strength of that supply chain. We're not here to advocate that you have to be totally transparent on every aspect of your strategy and your plan, but to keep that plan or that strategy close to your vest without engaging and sharing with others within the supply chain will undercut the overall effectiveness, especially when we talk about resilience in moments such as the one that we're in now. And when you look at headline news around the globe of how can we get a new vaccine out to market in record speed, are each of the pharmaceutical houses doing their own thing on their own plan? No, they're working together. Are the distribution firms that are going to be distribute the logistics firms, are they working together? Yes, they're all working with a common purpose, a common objective. And that becomes a core element of a resilient supply chain model, where all the players have a common purpose, a common direction, and they're willing to do things that they otherwise wouldn't be doing in order to make that new common purpose occur and to be captured, to be attained. If we were in a bricks and mortar environment right now, I'd be up in front of you and you'd be out in the audience in chairs, and I would look at you, and I can't do it on a webinar, but I'll sort of explain to you what I would be doing. I would take pause, ask each of you to, go along with me for just a few minutes here, and to everyone raise one of your two hands, doesn't matter left or right, raise one of your hands up in the air, and then close your eyes, and then I would ask you to each point to magnetic north. And when we do that in a bricks and mortar environment, and you've got 30 or 40 people in the room, all with their eyes closed with a hand up in the air, trying to figure where's north and pointing without looking at each other's answers, it becomes quite interesting, because after they've all decided to point in a certain direction, we then say, well, okay, everyone open your eyes and look around the room. And unfortunately, or I suppose fortunately, people are all pointing in different directions. Now, there's only one magnetic north available on the globe. There's only one of them that we can all point to. And yet each of us has our own definition, our own orientation towards what that might be. And so if we were to talk across our supply chain and say, let's be resilient, let's be collaborative, let's be innovative, that's great to say. However, we all have our own interpretations of what it means, and we're all going to point in somewhat different directions as to where that is and how we're going to get there. And so unless we have a common theme, a common strategy, a common orientation, if I was to point, and again, if we were in bricks and mortar and I was standing up at the front of the room at a podium, I said, okay, this podium right here is magnetic north. Now everyone close your eyes, raise your hand, and everyone point to magnetic north. Most of you, hopefully most, if not all of you, would be pointing at that podium and saying, well, we were told that's where we're going to head. That's where we need to point. And so there's that common definition. But unfortunately, in supply chains, multi-partied supply chains, that doesn't happen. Somebody needs to somewhat step up and say, here's the direction. Does we have any disagreements? We're open for discussion on this, but unless we have any major objections, let's go with this as being the direction, as the strategy, as the purpose that we have. And many of you in the audience, you are working in the public sector, in the Australian healthcare sector, and you are basically the big kid on the block, if you will. You're the ultimate, well, the patients and the citizens are the ultimate consumers, but within the supply chain, you are the customer. And all those various suppliers and contractors and vendors, et cetera, are all somewhat working together to satisfy you. And so if you're able to somewhat marshal those parties together into one room, say, here's our strategy, here's our plan, here's how we want to somewhat march north, we would find that many of those parties would try to do whatever they could in order to accommodate and march in that direction. And so we have to understand that without communication, without a common vision, the supply chain really is somewhat going to spin their wheels. And so to create greater value and to manage risk, there needs to be that strategic direction that gets shared. Now, in today's environment, what we're seeing over the last 6 or 8 months is that the supply chains, which were previously either very global or local, are somewhat hybriding into a sort of middle area where it's somewhat of a regional type supply chain. So it is not totally local, nor is it totally global. And so it's somewhat of this blend or this hybrid of regional healthcare supply chains are somewhat taking root over the last 6 to 9 months. And that change is something that we have to recognize. Once we're past the pandemic, will those supply chains revert back to their prior chemistry, if you will, of either being a local or a global market or supply chain? We yet to have seen how it's going to play out. But for now, the regionalized model is emerging as the model that most are now finding themselves in. Does this mean that local supply chains are being obliterated and that global markets are being totally ignored? No. We're just trying to point to you what some of the trends are that we're seeing within our clientele and the research that we're running and what we're hearing from those that are going through this. So just be aware of that regional element. We're also seeing not only is somewhat the geographic reach of supply chains changing, but the nature of how we commercially approach matters has been changing, and it's been changing for over 25 years. We have gone from, in 1994, a predominantly goods-focused type of economy to a services-focused economy. The biggest change or transformation over that 20-year window up to 2015 is where this is known as goods as a service, or GAAS. This component has emerged as one of new significance. For 2020, haven't seen the results yet, but I would be willing to venture a guess that it's around 33% slice of the pie, that the goods as a service has increased over the past 5 years from where we saw the research last conducted, and this needs to be factored into your strategies with your healthcare sector supply chain, where you increasingly are buying those goods more as a service rather than as a good. As an example of facilities management, people used to buy buildings, buy office space, buy laboratories, buy hospitals, and so forth, and construct them. But increasingly, we're seeing that somebody else will build the laboratory or the research lab or the doctor's offices, and then they will lease them out and do a facilities maintenance service contract where the user, the medical professional, is using that building, but they haven't bought the building as a good. They're using it and paying for it on a monthly or annual basis, and they're paying for it more as a service. And that might not be significant to you, but it's significant to many of the suppliers that are in your supply chains. So that has occurred within many of your suppliers and contractors. And for you to develop strategy, being blind to this fact, I just wanted to avoid that circumstance where you were not aware. We're also seeing that there is a greater movement away from cost reduction. There is a total cost of ownership mentality that continues to emerge. It's been emerging for the past 15 to 20 years, but in some corners of the profession and some of the industry and parts of the globe, people still are focusing on cost reduction, lowest cost. And so what this chart here is brought up to serve as an example is on how a service approach can be basically taken out of the outsourcing and the goods as a service methodology. And so what we're seeing is that rather than just trying to cut down on service costs and equipment costs, that organizations are continuing to deverticalize out and use more external service providers who can do that service more cost effective, do it with greater efficiency, and being able to do it with just overall greater effectiveness. They do generate higher savings, typically. If it is, for instance, the billing process in a medical office, if they outsource or they use contractors to run their billing process, if it's a large, well-run medical practice and they already were doing it pretty well, they still can capture around 3 to 5% savings. If they were a smaller firm and not doing it so well, around 20% is what we've been hearing and seeing as a expectation of what savings you could capture. And it's not just on getting the cheapest, but being more efficient. Lean service delivery, lean service design is emerging within the healthcare sector. And if you're not familiar with lean, I encourage you to give some additional energy into researching it, because it is an area that we're seeing taking on some extra legs, and it probably is going to be coming your direction here in the near future. So the contracting models, the supply chain models have changed over the past few years, over the past few months, to more of a regional focus. We increasingly are seeing services rather than purely goods. We're seeing services as a outsourced provider who can do it more effective. Those types of influence and forces continue to be coming at us. And so our strategy has to recognize that what we've been doing lately might not be where our strategy should take us. Yes, your contract and contract documents can and should be able to help. And so there's certain contracting models such as back-to-back documents, pass-throughs. There's templates that exist throughout the profession in certain areas. There's redundancy models around, we would have multiple contracts with multiple parties, even though we're not going to use all of them. We need those in case one of the providers within our supply chain proves to be incapable. We at least have backup plans, alternate contractors and suppliers in place. And so the contracts that we see in these models these types of models are being used more within the healthcare profession over the last year or so. Service level agreements, scopes of work, key performance indicators, what they're covering, how they're structured has been evolving and changing. And so if you're using an SOW model or a template now that you were using 5 years ago, it is something you probably should re-examine, because that has been changing. The service level agreements have been changing, the KPIs have been changing, and we want to make sure that you're focused on where are we heading in the future, what is the latest and greatest, not what have we done in the past. And we want to try to help get some new approaches. We want to make sure that the SRM methodologies and the contracts that we use do not create handcuffs and traps. We want to make sure that we're not shifting risk to every other party or all the risk into one party. We want to make sure that we don't override, ignore, replace those social norms. We don't want to force the other parties in our supply chain to innovate or to collaborate. Some organizations are not yet ready. Some organizations don't have within their culture the ability to do that. And so we have to have a certain cultural sensitivity as to who else is in our supply chain and what is their culture. And when we talk about culture, we don't necessarily always mean a geological, sociological culture. It's not, well, Australians have a certain culture and the Kiwis have a slightly different culture and the Canadians yet a different. We don't mean it on a geographic basis. We mean it really at times of more of a, what is their, the culture of their organization. Is the organization empowered versus very much controlled and governed? If they're very restricted as a culture within an organization, and they're in a supply chain endeavor with a very empowered, open, somewhat loose culture type organization, that ends up creating some great friction, some great hesitance between the parties. Understanding what your culture is versus what their culture is as a corporation is going to become really increasingly of greater importance. We don't want in terms of that disparate culture to become the tripping point for us to be able to progress forward as supply chain partners. And if there is some type of difference or divergence between cultures, to recognize those up front, you can, and it's certainly viable to continue forward as long as you understand and recognize that that difference is in place, and what does that mean as to how you're going to operate and interact with those other parties. So we want to make sure that we're not using our SRM techniques nor our contracts to make some of the major faux pas and stumbles that many have done, where they do try to somewhat trap and handcuff their commercial partners, that they try to, largely through their contracts or in the relationship, if there's a large amount of leverage in the favor of one party versus the other, to try to shift all of the risk around a project into that party who has the lower level of leverage or the higher level of dependency. That in many instances will not serve anyone within the supply chain well. If, say for instance, I'm a small testing lab, I'm in your supply chain, you're a large behemoth, and you're basically dictating to me that I have to take on all the risk associated with a project or a transaction, I probably will say sure. Because if I don't say yes, it means that I'm not going to get any more work, and then I'm going to have to shut down my lab. And so I'll say yes, even though I'm crazy in doing so. I shouldn't be saying yes. I don't have the means to manage the risk, but many times because I have to keep my lights on in the lab, keep the electricity, keep my payroll happy, I'm going to end up saying yes in my contracts and my commercial relationships. And that shouldn't be the case that we put those small players within our supply chain into. We do not want to somewhat push them into a corner where they say yes, even though they know they shouldn't be saying yes to the assumption of risk and to take on certain burdens that they otherwise, if a sane moment was in their head, they would be saying no to. And so we don't want to force the risk nor the culture differences. We don't want to force the other party to innovate and collaborate with us. So we want to foster a culture, an environment, a model in which there is going to be innovation. The thing though about innovation, and this has been a mantra that's been out there for a couple decades now, and every time I look at innovation, I've been involved with it and see clients who are involved, it seems to always rear its head. It's oversimplified, but it is something I want to make sure you've heard if you haven't heard it already. For us to innovate, and by the way, as a quick aside, innovation, this is the new frontier for us to get greater value for money. To squeeze the other parties in our supply chain for more profits, more margin, more risk, it isn't going to work. They have basically given as much as they can. And so for us as a player within our supply chain, to get additional value for money, it's going to have to be through some different mechanism. And the mechanism that's emerging as the most viable mechanism is innovation. And so creating innovation within this current economy, in this current market, is necessary. Even if we didn't have a pandemic, it is going to be necessary. But the innovation won't occur unless the parties are collaborating. Collaboration won't occur unless there's a certain elevated level and enriched level of trust between the parties. You're not going to have that elevated and enriched trust level unless there's first some foundational trust mixed in with some successful interactions between the parties. And to start it all off, there has to be a foundational trust. That foundational trust, we all have it in our commercial relationships. If you didn't trust a supplier, or if you were a supplier, speaking to them, if you didn't trust a customer, you wouldn't sign the contract. You wouldn't enter that relationship. So there is going to be this preliminary, bare bones, essential level, foundational level of trust that's needed. Once you have that trust, and it's going to be in almost any of our commercial relationships, you need to build a sequence of successful interactions. And then once those interactions are sufficient, you will then have a sort of trust level on steroids, an elevated and an enriched trust level. That enriched trust level will then allow the parties to collaborate, and the collaboration will then lead to end result innovation. And so for us, as that supplier relationship management professional, we've got to have somewhat of a plan that moves us from that foundational trust level up to that innovation level. It has to be over a sequence of steps. It cannot be in one big jump. You seldom will get to innovation from a very new, a very nascent relationship in your supply chain. The highest levels of innovation that we're seeing are arising when the parties have been with each other at least 3 to 5 years. They've been working on various other projects that have created and fostered and elevated and an enriched level of trust, and they have then started to collaborate more, and the innovation has come forward. There are always going to be exceptions to this methodology, to the sequence, but the vast majority of those who are in that high-performing innovation level have gone through this type of sequence. I would encourage you, when it comes to innovation, to ask yourself and your commercial partners, what is a win-win? What is a win for the other party, and what is a win for yourself? Many times when I ask in classes and in the projects where we help our clients, hey, we believe in a win-win. What is win-win? They say, well, a win-win is where I win and the other party wins too. When I hear that as a response, I get a little concerned, because the party who's responding is focused on themselves first rather than the other party. If they say, well, I make sure that the other party is going to get a win, and by them winning, then I also win as well. That focus shift is very encouraging, and it tends to generate a much higher likelihood of collaboration and innovation in those organizations. The what's in it for me versus the what's in it for you type of approach is something that we would encourage you to look at and ask yourself. So I want to give you an example of innovation, collaboration, higher levels of trust. There is, and I'm not going to mention them by name, there is a pharmaceutical distribution firm in the US, and they are a very big player. They really don't seem to quite understand innovation, collaboration, that whole approach, but they're hungry to get there. They, a few years ago, came up with a brilliant idea that they would create a virtual suggestion box through emails, through a website, a shared folder, where they were expecting suppliers and contractors to make a opportunity for improvement, a suggestion that their suppliers needed to each on a quarterly basis make certain suggestions. That pharmaceutical distribution firm basically is the customer in the relationship, and the suppliers were told or requested, hey, make suggestions once a quarter. It's expected of you. We encourage this. And suppliers, and trusting that this would be a good idea, every quarter they were turning in some suggestions. The only problem, the challenge, was that when this pharmaceutical distribution firm received the suggestions, they would go through the box and look for some really good ideas, and they found some. But the problem was, when they found a really good suggestion, to implement it, it needed to have collaboration, cooperation, participation from their suppliers. So who did they go out and reach to then proceed to the next step? Was it the supplier who made the suggestion? No, they would go out and competitively bid the idea to the supply base. And whoever came in with the cheapest price would be invited to participate in this great innovative idea. So many of the suppliers who were making these innovative, creative suggestions were basically just giving new opportunities to their competitors and that pharmaceutical distribution firm. If you keep doing things like that, you're going to find your suggestion box to be somewhat empty. And so going and competitively bidding those best ideas is something that we would encourage you to be cautious over and to not necessarily run forward. We want to make sure that the models, the relationships that you're putting together are going to allow you to tackle the VUCA, the volatility, the uncertainty, the complexity, the ambiguity that exists out there, and to treat that VUCA really more as an opportunity rather than a threat. There, academic out of the US has some great observations. This is a comment that I heard him make a few years ago, and I fully agree with it. To make the best out of a good situation, focus on what's going wrong and can go wrong and work on preventing that. For you to make the best out of a bad situation, it's encouraged that you focus on what's going right and what could right. Because if you focus on, in a bad situation, what's going wrong, or in a good situation, just on what's going right, it isn't going to make major improvements. That comes from Professor Robert Sutton, and he is out of Stanford in the US. The research that he's been doing around actual real life projects and applying this type of a methodology or perspective has proven it to be fairly spot on. So dealing with VUCA, opportunities versus threat. We need to, in the global biopharma market, the threats that have been most significant, that have been recognized and reported out, these are the threats or opportunities within the global biopharma market. Product development, partnerships and joint ventures forming, and mergers and acquisitions taking place. So I would like to ask you, as a participant in the industry, in the sector, if these are your either threats or opportunities, what are you doing within your supply chain to either take advantage of these opportunities or to avoid these threats? Are you looking at your weaknesses? Are you looking at your strengths in order to address these? And when I say your weaknesses and your strengths, not you as an entity, but you as a participant in a chain of other entities that can work on this as a collaborative set of opportunities. As an example of SWOT analysis, for those of you who haven't ever done SWOT, four-letter acronym, strengths, weakness, opportunities, and threats. Here's what United Healthcare, they're out of the US, this is what United Healthcare puts together as their SWOT analysis. Just one of their more recent ones, and they put this out on the public domain so anyone can, look at this. I'm not going to read each of these bullet points for the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, so I'll let you just take a look at them. I would suggest that with almost all of these, what are there, 5, 8, 10, there's 12 points here between strength, weakness, opportunity, threat. Of these 12 things, these sub-bullet points, could United Healthcare engage their supply base, their supply chain, engage supplier relationship management techniques, contracting techniques, commercial strategies to work with their contractors and suppliers in order to make these strengths and opportunities realized and these weaknesses overcome and these threats avoided? Can they do it by themselves, or do they need their supply chain in order to address the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats? And I would submit to you that United Healthcare is building strong supplier relationships across its supply chain and approaching these as collaborative efforts, not soloing them. Basically saying with their supply chain, this is north, using the analogy of what I shared with you 15 minutes ago. pointing to these and saying, hey, supply base, supply chain partners, this is our north in terms of our strengths and opportunities. This is where we don't want to go in terms of the weaknesses and threats. We want to have you work with us on these points. So I ask you, have you done your SWOT analysis for your organization? Have you engaged your suppliers, your supply base with this? Is that part of your strategy? Are you equipping yourself with the necessary skills and the players, the partners in your supply base with the necessary skills to do SWOT analysis and to get people on a multi-party strategy? Collaboration, according to the recent IBM Global CEO study, collaboration is the #1 professional skill needed across all organizations, from the healthcare sector to any other sector out there. That's top of the list. And yet, to collaborate, you need to have an engaged and enthused employee base. The challenge is 70% of the workforce is unengaged, and this comes from a Gallup poll, and I've seen other studies, similar percentage, 70, 75, 68% in that range, that have said that people in the workforce feel unengaged, they feel disconnected, they feel disenfranchised. And so if collaboration is the #1 skill needed, and yet our workforce is somewhat unengaged, our hurdle to overcome to get collaboration going for us with our commercial partners within our healthcare supply chain is a significant hurdle for us to overcome. I would like to present to you, here are the top 10 skills that the World Economic Forum drafted 5 years ago, back in 2015. And at the time, they said, back in 2015, here's what we see as the key skills. And now here we are forecasting 5 years into the future, 2020, what are going to be these top skills? So here we are now in today's discussion, 2020. How many of these skills have you been able to master with yourself or within your teams, your organization? And I would probably be correct in guessing that there are a significant number of these that are still on your to-do list. And so to get your team engaged, give them some new skills, give them somewhat of a futuristic look rather than keep shackling them to the past. We would encourage you, not only are skills important, but tools are important. We want to make sure that our toolbox is filled with, again, the strategies, the tendering documents that are going to help us look for more collaborative suppliers, more innovative suppliers, suppliers whose culture, corporate culture, and our culture are more closely aligned. So tendering can't just be the same old RFXs that we've been using. Using segmentation tools, and I'll get to that a little more in a moment. What are some of the shared data platforms, some of the key performance indicators for our relationship, for the enterprise, this amalgam of parties within our supply chain? What are some of those KPIs? Tools such as this, and for instance, let's just talk briefly about segmentation tools. A testing lab, in terms of how this opportunity with a pharmaceutical customer might be, they may see it as being, in a bottom left quadrant where it's, probably very attractive. And the pharma customer might perceive the relationship in the upper right quadrant. The testing lab might see the pharma customer as that bottom left type of customer, and the pharma customer may perceive the testing lab as the upper right red box within this screen. And so if we have a segmentation tool that we say we're the testing lab that we can use, we should be using it for ourselves, but also with our commercial partners, engaging them and assuming or somewhat guessing where they would be placing their analysis and perspective. We would encourage you to have a shared vision. This is increasingly part of collaborative relationships where the collaborative entities need to have a somewhat of a mutual vision. This comes from Canada, out of the Western province of British Columbia. This is a healthcare relationship that got created. I'm going to show you basically what their vision was. This Island Health Hospitalist, it's basically the client and a contractor, what they created for a shared vision. Rather than reading all the words on this and the next few slides to you, you're going to get a copy of the slides and of this presentation. I encourage you after the session, when you have chance to really read through this, to give it some thought. But this is basically, here's what they see as their shared vision. The shared vision is based off of perceptions of each other. They do spiderweb diagrams. They do basically a intended behaviors document where they lay out what their intended behaviors are in terms of dealing with their patients, the patient's values, others within the supply chain. It is multiple facets to their statements of their intended statement here to understand more than just in a word or phrase what they're going to do with each other. They really sat in a workshop to understand how they can come together and move in a collaborative fashion. Another tool is around the relational charter. This comment comes from a woman named Janet Grove, who was the attorney who was outside counsel when she saw what really went into an effective shared vision and guiding principle statement. She really felt that it was a game changer. And we encourage you to look for things that get the participants to raise their hand and say, this is breakthrough. This is beyond where we usually would go. I wanted to focus the comments today on healthcare, but I wanted to just share quickly a slide. This comes out of Australia, out of public sector, our friends in defense. This is what's called a relational charter. We're not saying that everything has to be visual like this, but we think this is a real good example of what the patrol boat enterprise did up in the patrol boats up in Darwin and going west over to Cairns, or east over to Cairns, in terms of patrolling the northern boundary of Australia. So this is a relational charter. They lay out 9 key dimensions or facets. They get into what their common mission is as a relationship and what their common vision is. So relational charters, creating mutual risk registers, where the risk register isn't my risk register nor your risk register, it's our risk register, and we share it. And we don't push risk onto the other party. We look for ways to go after risk together and mitigate the risk. We look at scorecards for value for money for the enterprise, for the team, for the entire supply chain. The exit strategies and the contract provisions that will allow for exit strategies are going to be different when it's in this type of a higher collaborative relationship. Having alternate clauses, fallback positions that are more appropriate and more fit for purpose rather than fitting and forcing certain clauses into the contract, that is a methodology that we highly discourage you from taking. And so finally, as a wrap up, the point I want to raise with you is try to find ways of crafting a strategy. And much of what we've covered so far today is what goes into a strategy and what are some of those key elements. But look at that strategy that's going to benefit the entire healthcare supply chain, not just you as one player within that supply chain. You could be the strongest link in your supply chain, but if you're surrounded and connected to a bunch of weak links, it really isn't going to be much of a supply chain. And so having a strategy that is broader, more encompassing, is the approach that we're seeing successful organizations taking, and we encourage you to give some thought from the session today and the comments that were made as to what a strategy like that would look like and what it would be needed to make that work. If you have any questions around that, don't hesitate in reaching out to us. We want to make sure that the strategy is beneficial for everyone within your supply chain, not just you. If you're making some capturing benefits and everyone else is seeing disadvantages, you're going to be in that supply chain by yourself relatively soon. So look for those mutual risks across your supply chain, across that enterprise, and find ways to mitigate, eliminate those risks together, not just putting them on the shoulders of one of the parties. Find opportunities to increase the value for money. How can we maximize those as a supply chain? And so once you start focusing in that direction, we find, as others have, that you're going to be able to capture much greater value because of the higher levels of innovation, which will only be in place because of higher levels of collaboration. And that higher level of collaboration is only going to be occurring because you've put a strategy together, you're working with the other members in your supply chain as a unified body rather than as disparate, disconnected links within that supply chain. So I know I haven't left much room for questions, but I've been watching the menu and I haven't seen any questions come up in the session. So I felt I would just keep filling out the full hour with narrative since there weren't many questions. If you have any, this would be the time to put them into the menu. Rowena, I'm gonna see if you want to make any closing comment before we wrap up, because I know we're at the top of the hour. But if you do have questions, if you want to reach out to us, the website, commercialofficers.com, there's my email address. But Rowena, anything from you? Any questions or comments before we sign off today?
No questions, Jim, but thank you. That was very comprehensive, and I hope the attendees did get a lot of value out of that session. So once again, thanks for delivering that. Much appreciated.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And thank you for everyone for sitting in, listening in. Hopefully it was of value to you, and we look forward to getting some feedback. So with that said, thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much now. Bye-bye.